This is Open Minds Radio. Here again, your host, UFO paranormal researcher and journalist, Alejandro Rojas.
Hello and welcome to Open Minds Radio. This is Alejandro Rojas. Open Minds is your UFO news authority. You are so lucky to have us. And again, we have a wonderful show. Really, we have yet again a very hard to get interview. We have Jacques Vallée. In fact, I don't know that he's done an interview with anybody in this field. Well, he was on Coast to Coast not too long ago. But other than that, really, I think they prefer us over Coast much of the time, too. I just get that feeling. But this is going to be awesome. If you do not know who Jacques Vallée is, I wouldn't be too surprised, especially if you're fairly new to the field, because he's a researcher that was around forever. But you know what? Here's what's going to clue you in, jog your memory, is that the movie Close Encounters, done by Stephen Spielberg, the main guy, Lacombe, the French guy, who is always that's my French impersonation. I really don't know any French. But that guy is modeled after Jacques Vallée, our guest today, who was a French-born researcher. He came here as a computer scientist and started to get into UFOs. He eventually worked with J. Allen Hynek, who was the advisor for Close Encounters, the movie. And then he also inspired Peter Sturrock, which is great because he was an astronomer who went on to do some great things in this field, as long as Vallée. In fact, Vallée was really one of the first people who started turning people in on the idea of what we call the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that UFOs are probably the result of highly advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. However, eventually, he started to see evidence that changed his mind, or at least made him think that the answers are much more complicated than that. Of course, a lot of people feel that way. And he started thinking about some interdimensional possibilities. Also, just like his brand new book, which just came out, Wonders in the Sky. It was released like a week or two ago. You can go to Amazon and buy it right now. I'm sure it's an awesome book. I can't wait to read it. And he goes into history and all of the mythology and stories that are very similar to UFO and ET stories that we hear today. So I'm really excited to talk to him. One of his first books in 1970 was called Passport to Magonia, which really started getting into these different ideas. And it's just some really neat, exciting stuff because some of these historic stories are very, very interesting. So this is going to be a lot of fun today. I am so excited to have him. This is going to be great. Jason, this is going to be awesome, man. A couple other things before we get into that. First of all, the UFO Congress, I think I mentioned this last time, or actually a couple weeks ago, is that now we have Paul Hellyer. He was the ex-Minister of Defense. We had a wonderful show with him a couple weeks ago, and he's going to be speaking at the UFO Congress, which is the largest UFO conference, and it's going to be right here in the Phoenix metro area, February 23rd to the 27th. You can go to ufocongress.com to look this up, or to our website at openminds.tv. We're having Linda Howe, Leslie Keene, James Peniston, George Filer, some of these interviews that we've done recently. In fact, we have a great interview with Linda Howe that we're going to have on the show next week, and it's all about where she went to an Air Force base in Albuquerque, and they showed her some secret files of which she remembers the details, and she believes them to be real. Extraordinary stuff if you haven't heard this, and she breaks it down in detail. So this is going to be a great show next week. You're going to want to check that out. Also, we have a lot of cool stuff on YouTube. Maybe Jason will mention some of that stuff. We posted something just the other day that's gotten thousands of hits because it's just that exciting and extraordinary and cool. And you need to go to our YouTube page and subscribe. Actually, it's some stuff that we find in mostly Windows archives, and some of it is, of course, highly debatable. Some of it's some extraordinary pictures that people, say really happened, and we're just posting them up there for everyone to see because we want people to see Wendell's records and decide for yourself whether these things are real or not. It's going to be very important for you to go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated when we post this stuff. In fact, last weekend, I was in California at a conference, and someone gave me some very interesting video that we're going to be putting up there really soon to see what you guys think. I think that he probably caught the real deal. He caught some strange lights flying in the sky. So this is going to be really cool. A lot of fun. As usual, before we get to our guest, we got to tell you about all of the UFO news in the headlines out there. Always a lot going on. And we've got our news correspondent, Jason McClellan, to share all of that with us. Jason, how are you, buddy?
Good, Alejandro. How are you?
Doing all right.
Excellent. Hello, world, and this is your Open Minds News Brief for Monday, November 8th, 2010. Now, I know I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to say it again as a reminder. There could be an increase in UFO reports during the next couple weeks because the planet Venus will be extremely brilliant in the early morning sky. It's going to catch a lot of people off guard because they're going to go out early morning before they go to work, if they go to work that early, and see this strange, very bright light in the sky.
Like how early?
Right before the sun comes up.
Right before the... Oh, man. There's no way I'm going to be able to get up that early because that would be cool to see.
I didn't say you have to see it, Alejandro.
I know, but that'd be
Just
cool
be
to
aware
see.
of
I
it.
kind of want to.
Well, wake up early.
Yeah.
Get some pictures.
Yeah.
But just be aware that if you see a bright light, really bright light in the early morning sky, it won't necessarily be Venus, but it could be. Just have to throw that out there.
Mm-hmm. No, it's important so people don't think these things are UFOs because just like you hear often, Venus is the number one culprit for misidentifications.
Right, but I do like to throw that out to let people know, don't just dismiss everything you see in the sky and say, oh, that must be Venus. That's what they were talking about. Just know that that could be what you're seeing in the sky. In other news, on the night of Halloween, multiple strange lights were seen in the sky above the East Croydon area of London. A local couple noticed the lights while they were outside taking pictures of their prized pumpkins. The lights drifted slowly across the sky in a diamond formation and slowly moved into a linear formation. There were 5 lights in total, and they all dimmed out after approximately 10 minutes. Now, I don't want to burst their bubble, and they specifically said these witnesses said they'd seen Chinese lanterns before. Mm-hmm. And the lights they observed, they said, Chinese lanterns don't move like that through the sky, and they don't go off like these lights did. Well, Chinese lanterns last approximately 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And moving through the sky, they're released at different times. So some are higher than others. You have your lows and your highs, and the wind currents are different at certain altitudes.
Yeah, I hate to sound like a skeptic or a debunker, but, I've seen a lot. Over the years, especially as a researcher, you see a lot of video and stuff. I've seen balloons, because typically before the Chinese lanterns, it was balloons. And often there are balloons in the sky. And they move at different speeds. They can do some really weird stuff. People don't realize that there are multiple levels of air current in the sky. The higher you go, you could be at one height and the air is going one way. And higher up in the sky, the air is literally, the wind's blowing in the opposite direction. That happens. So a lot can happen. And
you're exactly right.
Wind could be cruising.
Some of these things can look like they're standing still, and then others could look like they're zooming. Yeah. Just because they're in an air current.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I talk about this too is that I used to get frustrated with the people who had analyzed video and be like, how can you say that that's not? But when you're analyzing video and when we're looking for evidence, you want to have something that is incontrovertible, to show people, to show, there's nothing, wind couldn't do this or wind couldn't do that. And there are some videos like that. Just to demonstrate, that these aren't. And I think you're going to bring up a couple of stories where there were some videos that are unexplainable.
Right. And again, I'm not saying that these are, without a doubt, Chinese lanterns. They do demonstrate some of the behavior, and Chinese lanterns are tricky suckers. They really are. Yeah. But, I certainly know that a lot of unexplained things look similar to Chinese lanterns, too. So I'm not saying that these are Chinese lanterns, but... Here's a cool story. One man believes there are remnants of an ancient civilization on the moon. Richard Hoagland claims that NASA's orbital and surface photographs show ancient ruins on the moon. And he also indicates that the remnants are from an extraordinarily advanced civilization with advanced technology. Hoagland believes that NASA knowingly concealed information about a lunar civilization from the public because it was determined the public wasn't ready to accept such incredible information. And while some might find the idea of an ancient lunar civilization a little hard to believe, I should point out that Hoagland is a former NASA consultant and curator of astronomy and space science at the Springfield Science Museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. He also consulted CBS News during the Apollo moon missions.
Yeah, he's a very, very interesting speaker. I mean, we got a lot of requests to have him at the Congress, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that, but hopefully in the future. But I've seen him speak, and it's interesting.
The UK's The Telegraph and other media outlets reported last week that after 30 years, military audio recording of the Rendlesham Forest incident had been released. On the tape, you hear Colonel Charles Halt leading the investigation and describing the situation as weird. But this audio didn't just surface. In fact, it's been out since 1984.
Yeah, I don't know why. Well, you know, the first story to post this was The Sun. They said new video released. I noticed, because I was really perplexed by it, by the end of the day, they took down the story. But in that short amount of time, these other news outlets must have picked that up and believed it. And I'm assuming the Sun found out their mistake, and it's not the first time the Sun's been wrong. They've been wrong a lot where they say a video is from the wrong place or wrong time. And but yeah, the videos have been out for a long time.
Here's another cool story that has some video that went along with it. An orange-colored glowing orb that has been spotted at least 4 times since June was recorded on video speeding through British airspace. The silent object was seen flying quickly over Newquay Airport. Airport personnel were unable to identify the craft. And I know you saw this video. You see this dot kind of zooming through the sky.
Now that doesn't look like a Chinese lantern or a balloon.
No.
Yeah, you have this orb really cruising through the sky over an airport, or was it even an Air Force base or something, or just an airport? I can't remember.
I'm not sure. The details I saw just said it was British airspace. So.
Yeah,
but it looked like it was at an airport or a military field. So. Last Tuesday was Election Day here in the United States, and Initiative 300, the Denver ballot initiative seeking to create an extraterrestrial affairs commission, did not pass. Nearly 70% of the voters voted against the initiative, but in case you need some mathematical assistance, that means that 30% voted for the creation of an extraterrestrial affairs commission. That's approximately 50,000 people in one U.S. city alone. I think that number's incredible.
Well, and if it's 30% that are going that far, where they would vote on something like that, and we don't even know the final numbers, which I'd like to find out.
We don't, and that's another interesting story, because even today actually it was yesterday, I was watching CNN, and they brought up the initiative, and they were still showing the initial numbers that were published, the 84% or whatever, and that's what most media outlets have carried. They haven't updated the numbers at all.
Yeah, because the latest we get our 30% from CBS, I think it is, or it's one of the Denver news stations, which showed 64% of the precincts reporting, which was the latest update we had seen. So that obviously there's a lot more people, and those numbers could be more like 70,000 or something like that voted on it. I'd love to see, but of course if it is 30%, that's certainly significant, going as far as saying, you know, we need something to tell us about not just UFOs, but extraterrestrials.
Yeah. There was another reported sighting of the famous Phoenix lights last week. A skywatcher was monitoring public webcams when she noticed the lights in the Phoenix sky. The skywatcher recorded what she was seeing and posted the video to YouTube. Now, I saw this video, and you can see the lights going on and off and sort of throughout the evening as it becomes dark. And being where we are right now in our studio, we have the airport just down the street from us, Sky Harbor International Airport. And we see these lights all the time. And to me, again, I have no proof. It certainly could be something else, but it looks like what we see all the time with airplanes coming in for a landing at a busy airport, because you just see these lights, these string of lights, these airplanes at different altitudes with their landing lights on.
Yeah. Yeah, we have that. You can walk outside and see lines in pretty much all the directions of planes coming in lined up to land, because it's a busy airport, and it's a flat area for the most part. And I agree with you. I think that's what she got.
It was still a cool video to watch, though.
Yeah.
And it's really cool that people are out there monitoring these public webcams, looking for things in the sky.
Very cool.
Keep looking. Keep your eyes on the cameras. And here's a really cool story, too, that had some video that went along with the story. Several shoppers observed a blue, unidentified flying object in the sky above Centerville, Virginia, Wednesday night. The blue light moved silently through the sky, changing directions, then shooting upwards. One witness grabbed his cell phone and captured video of the UFO. The object was visible for approximately 10 minutes. This was really cool. You don't see this that often, a blue light moving through the sky. And it's caught some national media attention.
Yeah,
even today.
Starting to get the rounds, which is great, because they were picking up on stories where it did appear they were balloons or the parachute guys out of Texas.
Right.
But they weren't picking up on what seemed to be legitimate UFOs. And this does. I mean, the video's great. You see this blue thing slowly cruising across the sky. Witnesses said it stopped and hovered, did these different maneuvers. And in the video, you see the center of this thing's very bright. I mean, it gets really bright. It's a very strange blue light. And there's even aircraft specialists who have commented to the news saying that, aircraft don't use that color of light. So it's definitely not a conventional aircraft. So very strange. This is another great video that's come out recently that appears to be a real UFO.
Right. And again, I'll mention that when I first saw it, before I actually watched the video, when I heard about the blue UFO and saw a still image of it, I thought right away, oh, this could be one of those LED balloons. LED balloons are becoming popular now, too, and a lot of the places that sell Chinese lanterns also sell LED balloons. And you can get these balloons that have an LED light inside them of any color, blue being one of those. But when you watch the video and when you hear what witnesses described with the movements of this thing and how it shot up, a balloon wouldn't do that.
When you see this, the light source is very bright.
Right.
I mean, I think it was even a video specialist had commented about how bright the light was, where it really, I forget the term when something's really bright for a camera, but it essentially, is a very, very bright spot in the middle of this thing. Great video. Of course, we have this posted, guys, and we have one of the stories. Jason posted something Friday. I posted another story that talked about it today, so you can find that on the front page of our website. Go look at that video.
That's right. And that is it for the news. Remember to check out these stories and more at openminds.tv, your source for UFO-related news. I'm Jason McClellan, your correspondent, and you've been briefed. Back to you, Alejandro.
All right. Thank you, Jason. That was some interesting stuff. There's always some really good news going on. That's what gets me really excited. And if there isn't news, regardless of what the conventional dudes out there are doing, we're always providing you with some of the coolest stuff. Some of the stories that we've had up lately. I don't know. I didn't do news last time, so I don't know if I mentioned, probably not, our Zachariah Ascension stuff. Luckily, Antonio Huneas, who is one of our editors for the magazine, he's also contributing writer, and he's been in the business for decades. Of course, you know that I talk about him a lot, and you've heard him on the show. But he wrote a really cool memorial for Zachariah Sitchin. For those of you who go to the Coast and Coast website, they actually posted that on their front page. And he had some interesting stories, because Antonio lived in New York, which is where Sitchin lived. And so they got to meet, and he met him, and they were able to share some interesting stories. In fact, there was a story that Antonio talks about where he was with Sitchin in his apartment when Shirley MacLaine came by. And Antonio even has a story that we put up on our website. So that's really cool. It's a really great story. And we also then posted up soon after that a fairly long interview that Antonio did with Zachariah, where he's taken bits and pieces of this interview and used it for different stories. But we posted the interview in its entirety on the website, so you can read some very interesting ideas that Zachariah had. And unfortunately, I guess I should mention, for those of you who might not know, that Zachariah Sitchin actually did pass away early in October, although really people weren't notified till his website went up, notifying people of this around the 28th of October. And they said that they didn't notify people because they wanted some privacy. He's got a lot of fans around the world because he's a best-selling author. And if you're unaware, he wrote about really his translation of Sumerian inscriptions, Sumerian hieroglyphs. They're called cuneiforms. You could look this up, but essentially reading some of the legends of the Sumerians, who the first civilization to really have recorded history a few thousand years ago. And they talk about, beings coming from the sky and having interacting with humans and enslaving humans, and this whole story. It's also where the 10th planet, the Nibiru thing, comes from, if you've heard of that. So very interesting stuff. You'll have to check that out. We also have a little story on, of course, we talked about Initiative 300, and also they're going to try to do this in New York. We've had Michael Luckman on the show before, who wrote the book Alien Rock, about rock stars and their interfaces or their belief of extraterrestrials and UFOs, sometimes claiming to have interacted with extraterrestrials. And he is also someone who lives in New York, and he's going to try to start up a similar initiative out there to get people to vote on an extraterrestrial commission of some sort. So good luck to him out there. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully it goes better than it did in Denver. Although, like Jason said, 30% is not all that bad. Another story that we posted just recently on Friday is the UFO Case Files Revealed, Part 7. So we've talked about these quite a bit. This is something that our aerospace historian, Michael Schratt, has put together. You may have seen his talk where he goes over some of these stories. Lots of these are from the Center of UFOs for UFO Studies, which is an organization that was started by J. Allen Hynek, and they collected a lot of UFO reports, of course. But he took those reports and others, and then being a draftsman, he put together some photographs to demonstrate what these things look like, or, the areas they had flown in. So you can check that out. Some interesting stories from New Hampshire and from California, from Spain, and from Michigan. And it's interesting because the Michigan one is essentially a triangular craft flying over a highway, and the Central Valley, California one from 2004 is sort of similar. It's this large craft that came down low over this highway, just a few feet over the traffic, and kind of flew around before flying back up and flying away. So some real interesting close calls, close encounters, you might say. Also, we're going to have a story up tomorrow on a Chilean book that came out, and this is interesting because it's one of the people, we've talked about James Fox and Leslie Kean and this press conference that they had a few years ago where they brought a lot of generals and some of other people who are very credible to talk about UFOs from other countries. I can't remember the details of this one, but this Chilean, I think he was a pilot who wrote a book, and we're going to have this story up tomorrow, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get it up today before the show, but that's okay, because something new is always good. Other news that we have from the website before our guest comes on. Another video that we posted is sort of interesting. Alien cosmonaut photographed in Japan, it's called. And essentially this is, like I said, from the Wendell Archives. And it's this video of this Jason put together giving some information about this very strange picture that was taken by a Japanese man in 1975. And it looks to be like some sort of person or entity or something like that. Very interesting picture. Of course, some of these that we've posted are highly controversial, but they are very interesting as well. And really what we're doing is putting these up here just to say, you know, here's some of the pictures from Wendell's archives. People are always asking us, you know, when are you going to release that stuff? And we're doing it constantly. And kind of just putting them up there for you to look at to determine whether or not you think they're real or not. In fact, we just got a fairly new suite of pictures that we put up on a video today. So you're going to have to check that out. Of course, those are on the front page of openminds.tv. But enough about the website and the news, and let's go ahead and bring on our guest. I'm very excited to talk to him, Jacques Vallée. Are you there?
Yes, a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Definitely, I think a lot of people in this field are great fans, and it's going to be really fun to talk about all of the incredibly interesting things that you've worked on in the past. I guess my first question, though, is, you know, being a computer scientist, you know, coming from kind of the conventional world, what got you into looking into UFOs?
Well, you know, my early training was in astronomy, not in computer science.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if I had played my cards right, I would be in Hawaii, Hawaii on top of a mountain looking at the stars. My destiny was to fall in love with computers along the way, and then I became a computer scientist. I've always been driven by curiosity. I mean, that's what got me into, you know, being passionate about science and being passionate about astronomy. What intrigued me about UFOs was that, of course, growing up in France as a teenager, there were many reports in the media, and I heard of things close to me. And then when I was, about 15, I observed something in the sky. It was about 3/4 of a mile away. I was with my mother. She saw it first and called my attention to it. The next day, I checked with friends of mine, and one of my friends in college had observed the same object from a point about another half mile or 3/4 miles away from where I was with binoculars, and he described it exactly the same way I did. And it was a disc
Mm-hmm.
with a dome on top. It was a fairly typical object, middle of the afternoon in the summer. Very bright and the color of silver or aluminum.
Uh-huh.
And
what year was that?
1955.
Wow. Yeah, because I know in France in the 50s, it was just UFO crazy. There were so many sightings all over the place. I even read of a story and I can't really say the name of the town very well. I know it had something that Papot, Chateau de Papot or something like that. The mayor had even banned UFOs from their grape vineyards.
Well, if you like wine, you should know the name of the town. It's Châteauneuf du Pape. Yes, they were in. This was a year before I saw this in
Wow.
September, October, November 1954. There was a major wave, not just over France. It was best documented over France, but it extended from actually southern England to northern Italy, and Spain as well. So, the phenomenon comes and goes. It comes in waves over specific areas of the globe.
How was it treated back then in Europe? Was the phenomena taken fairly serious?
The French scientists are very conservative. They pride themselves on being what they call rationalists. And most of them just rejected it out of hand without actually wanting to look at the data. There were only a few people who looked at the data seriously. Later on, my first job was at the Paris Observatory as an astronomer, tracking satellites. And on successive nights, we tracked an object that was very bright, was as bright as the Echo satellite, was on a retrograde orbit. It was seen several times. And we got 11 data points on it. And the man in charge of the project, my boss essentially, erased the tape. Now, the whole team saw this, got enough points to compute an orbit, but we were never able to compute the orbit because the tape was erased. Now, that's really what started me. Up to then, I still had some doubts. I thought, well, if there were things like this in the sky, astronomers would see them and astronomers would tell us. And here we were, an official team of astronomers at Paris Observatory observing something we couldn't explain, but, there might have been natural explanations. It could have been, I don't know, an asteroid caught in Earth orbit for a few orbits. It would have been very interesting to compute an orbit. In fact, working with Dr. Hynek later at Northwestern, I found out that the same thing had been tracked in the United States by photographic stations of Grumman. So there was no question there was something there. It was unidentified, and we were destroying the data. And it was not a cover-up.
Wow.
It was just fear of ridicule. What are people going to say?
Mm-hmm. Which seems to be, something among pilots and among astronomers and among military personnel. A lot of this was not, especially early on, a cover-up, but just fear of ridicule.
Yes, absolutely. And it would not advance your career. And if you were an Allied pilot and so on, it would make you suspect. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that you may have seen Leslie Kean's recent book and so on, by the fact that pilots now, control tower operators and so on are coming out with speaking out in the first person, openly about what they've seen. I mean, that's very encouraging.
Right. And I think the more it happens, then the less fearful these guys get to talk.
Well, and then you find out that, geez, your neighbors saw the same thing,
right.
and your boss saw the same thing, and
yeah.
all of a sudden it's not that weird anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one more, unexplained thing in science, but science is full of things that are unexplained.
Well, it seems that you didn't have that fear, that you had the courage to kind of say, I'm looking into this and I'm going to share that with the world. And why do you think that is?
Well, I wasn't the only one. I mean, there were other people, other astronomers who had that courage. I was, maybe I was young and foolish, but the fact that, certainly computer science has been built by a bunch of, of rebels and people who would not follow the rules necessarily. I mean, the people who developed the kind of email system and the kind of graphics that you use every day now in major companies and so on are people who were fired from their job because they were not supposed to work on things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole generation was fairly ambitious in that respect. And
did the whole UFO and possibly your sighting did that help pique your interest in astronomy?
No, I was. I've always loved astronomy, and I still do. I don't, work in astronomy anymore. I try to follow it to the best I can. But no, I think my passion was there from, when I was a kid, actually.
I thought
And of course, when I came to the U.S. to a great extent, because in the U.S. I could work on both astronomy and computers and UFOs with a lot more freedom. Certainly, if I had stayed in France, I would not have been able to do the things I've done. I joined the University of Texas Astronomy Department. I worked on the first computer-based map of Mars for NASA. I wasn't a NASA employee. We had a NASA contract at the university. And I worked on galactic spectra with de Vaucouleurs, who was my boss, who was also a French astronomer who had left France early and was a member of the Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Academy of Sciences. And he was completely open-minded about UFOs, and he was letting me work on it as much as I wanted, as long as I was doing the job I was supposed to do for the university.
Mm-hmm. Well, and which is great because I know you went on to be an inspiration for a lot of people. I found it kind of interesting that Peter Sturrock really gives you the credit for getting him interested in UFOs. He said he didn't take it serious till he had met you. And, of course, Dr. Sturrock also did a lot of great things for the field.
Yes, and, of course, Dr. Sturrock himself was very open-minded and had already had an interest in parapsychology. And when I noticed, I was working for him at the time on the database project, and when I noticed all the references to parapsychology, that's when I was encouraged to tell him about my own interests in with UFOs. So no, it's once you break through the stupid rules that sometimes the establishment places on us, it's really a wonderful adventure. I mean, that's a lot of science has been done this way, by people exploring things that they were not supposed to explore.
Right.
I mean, both in biology, in medicine, and in astronomy. And one of the, as you may know, I just published a book with Chris Aubeck.
Right.
Chris is an Englishman living in Spain, and we've co-authored this book called Wonders in the Sky. One of the remarkable things in the book is to see how open-minded science was in the days of the Enlightenment, and in the 17th and 18th century, and even in the early years of the 19th century, when scientists were openly reporting, observing unusual things in the sky,
right,
and publishing it in scientific journals.
Right.
And we wonder, whatever happened to that scientific spirit?
Yeah.
How did it become the kind of establishment, constipated, administrative, bureaucratic thing that we have today, where a scientist is not supposed to do research on certain things? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just ironic that the people who should be exploring mysteries, I mean, that's what it's all about, anomalies and coming up with hypotheses for these anomalies. That's what science is about. Those are the same people who are kind of squashing people when they try to do that.
And they don't even take the trouble of looking at the data.
Mm-hmm.
Now, indeed, when you look at the data, of course, 80% of it is explainable. So it's an easy conclusion that, well, if I spent a little bit more time, I would be able to explain the other 20%. But in fact, maybe that attitude was justified, in the late 40s and the 50s. But today, the database is so strong and so robust,
yeah,
that you can't justify doing that anymore.
It's funny because something what you had just said kind of reminded me of this idea that usually the more you discover, the more questions you find. So I guess if it's kind of like quitting ahead and gambling, if you quit asking the questions, then you'll feel like you have a lot more answers than if you keep asking questions and getting more questions. I want to talk a lot about the book because I love that stuff. It's really interesting, but I do want to touch on a couple more things in your history, and of course, one of the exciting ones for the general public is your kind of being an inspiration for Close Encounters and the main character Lacombe in Close Encounters. How did that come about, and did you get to meet Spielberg?
Yes, I met him several times. Down in Hollywood, and he told me that he had read my books when he was much younger, had always been interested in UFOs, had read my books, and I think he was just amused by the idea of a French scientist in the U.S. trying to argue that the phenomenon was not just physical phenomenon, but also had a sociological impact. And that's certainly one of the things that make the movie so interesting, is that we see the witnesses going through the agony of trying to convince people around them, including their close family, that they are not crazy. They've really seen these things, and they are really out there, and so on. And that's what makes it both tragic and beautiful.
Yeah, I think that was the one English line that Dr. Lacombe had, where he made his point, and that this is an event sociological.
Yes, exactly.
Which
there are many other wonderful things that he said that were cut from the movie, but Spielberg really had fun with this.
Well, that is a great point, though, and I love that point because that's such an important aspect. I think it's just as important as many of the other aspects. I think, in fact, that it kind of gets unfortunate sometimes that we have these astronomers who are really kind of getting out of their discipline, and somehow it's okay for them to do that, or it's not okay for others. And really they're addressing sociological issues to kind of really buttress their own astronomical theories, as opposed to getting more sociologists involved and seeing what they have to say.
Yes, Dr. Eric Davis and I, Dr. Davis works in Texas at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, and we've published a model that we worked on together, about a model of a phenomenon, saying this is not a phenomenon you can study with just the tools of one science. You cannot do it with just physics. You have to look at the different layers. It's a little bit like the layers on the internet. There's a physical layer, a transport layer, a communication layer, and so on. It's a little bit the same thing with UFOs. There is a physical phenomenon at the core of it. But there is also, an aspect that is the impact on the psychology of the witness, the way the phenomenon seems to take control of the reality of the witness when they are close to it. There's a physiological impact, which is just as important as the physical. And then there's the sociological and the cultural. What is this doing to our culture?
Right.
And it's only now that there are a few people, in academia who are beginning to look at this. The most prominent one is Dr. Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University, who just published a book published by the University of Chicago called Authors of the Impossible, where he looks at both parapsychology and UFOs, and at exactly the right academic level. But it's about time that people did that.
Right, because it's unfortunately been far and few between. And interesting enough, another aspect I think that was interesting, including in sociological aspects, was you were one of the main people who had convinced a lot of people that this phenomena could be extraterrestrial in nature, and showing some science behind that. I know Hynek, I don't think ever really subscribed to that theory, but of course, eventually you kind of modified your perspective on that. And up to this day, from your Passport to Mangonia in the 70s to your new book, it seems like you're widening the exploration that it might be a much more complicated situation.
Well, yeah, you bring me back to the sins of my youth, so to speak. I got into this as a brash young astronomer and computer scientist, and the 70s were a very heady time, the 60s and the 70s, especially in computer science. I mean, it was an explosive time, both in terms of the hardware, and we had remarkable machines compared to what had been available just a few years before, and of course the software. There were many inventions in software, and it seemed that with the training that we had, we thought we could solve the UFO problem.
Mm-hmm.
And by applying the tools of science, I mean the ordinary tools of science, pattern recognition, statistics, correlations, and so on. So we built one of the first databases, my wife and I, of cases, first from French cases, and then when I had access to the Air Force files in my work with Dr. Hynek, I convinced Dr. Hynek that the patterns in the French cases were still there in the American cases. Mm-hmm. Because he used to say, well, we don't have anything like this here. And I showed him that the patterns that emerged from the unidentified cases in the Air Force files, and they were, if you remember, there are over 800, were the same patterns that we had seen in France. Mm-hmm. And that's what turned him around, and that's when he started very courageously arguing for the extraterrestrial theory, which, of course, in those days I did too, mm-hmm. because that seems to be, that's the most obvious thing you think of. Obviously, this phenomenon appears to be able to move through the air, but also through space. And
it's funny
we know we know that there must be life throughout the universe. At the time, it was a marginal speculation, but today, I mean, it's accepted by many astronomers, or most astronomers.
Yeah, I mean, really, people like to refer to Occam's razor, but using that, it's a debate, really where the conclusion would be at. If these are phenomena that can't be reproduced by our technology, then almost the Occam razor, exercising it, falls on the extraterrestrial hypotheses. We know they're out there. There's probably advanced cultures. So it makes sense to come to that conclusion.
Until you look more deeply at the cases and you look at what happens in close encounters, mm-hmm. and you look at the databases and you start doing some advanced statistics or data mining, and then you find that it's one of the theories you obviously have to keep looking at, because it's a big universe out there, mm-hmm. and you cannot say there are things that cannot happen in that universe. But the problem is that theory does not explain the facts. It doesn't explain what the witnesses are telling me. They are not telling me that, in most cases, they're not telling me that they saw something come from the sky, land and do a few things and then go back into the sky. Mm-hmm. They're telling me that something appeared suddenly, sometimes disappeared suddenly, sometimes disappeared by becoming transparent and fading in place, sometimes merging with other physical objects. And for a long time, we covered up. People are always talking about cover-up, but the ufologists are the worst offenders. They cover up all these sort of borderline, cases until there are so many of them that you can't cover it up anymore. I mean, you really have to look at it. The paranormal behavior is obvious. And then if these witnesses are really seeing this, then we're dealing with a phenomenon that could come from anywhere, anytime.
It's funny you say that, especially concerning what we were talking about before. It's almost like the ufologists sometimes fall prey to that whole ridicule factor, just like we talked about with pilots and things. But they don't want to be ridiculed by their peers in ufology, so they shy away from adding all the facts sometimes to the research.
And it's a natural human tendency. I've fallen into that trap myself, saying, well, these must be, maybe the witness was so amazed by what he saw. I mean, it's a formidable phenomenon. It's something that changes your life when you're close to one of these things. And maybe their perception was changed to the extent that they thought the thing was disappearing, becoming transparent, and it was because they were blinded by it, or they were. So when you have just a few cases like that, it's easy to rationalize that this was just, after all, it was just a normal spacecraft from another planet, And, geez, when you have too many of those, you say, well, this is nothing like a normal spacecraft from another planet. It's much more intriguing, much more mysterious, much more complex.
And especially when you add in historical references, one of my favorite being the one that you named Magonia after. I think his name was Robert Plot, it was the Bishop of Lyon.
Yes, the Archbishop Saint Agobard in 842. Yes, and the people around. Now, Saint Agobard was a rationalist. That's the beauty of it. He was one of the towering intellects of his time. The Archbishop of Lyon was as powerful politically as the King of France in those days. And he was, subject only to the Pope in terms of authority in the world. So he had considerable political, clout. And he left 22 different books, mostly attacking superstitions. And one of the superstitions he was attacking was the idea that witches could change the weather. Of course, people have always believed that witches, witchcraft could make tempests and storms and so on. And he ridicules that by saying this would take something from the majesty of God if human beings, even witches, could do this. They can do little things, cause a cow to die maybe, but they cannot raise a storm. So he gives the example of a belief in ships in the clouds as an example of another superstition that he thinks is ridiculous. And he says that one day the people of Lyon brought him 4 human beings in chains, 3 men and 1 woman, who had come out of a ship that came down from the clouds. And that of course, the people thought they were witches and they should be put to death. And he preached to the crowd that there couldn't be such a thing as a ship in the cloud, that they must be mistaken by some other phenomenon, and they should let these people go. And that has survived. Of course, he writes that in one of his books, that in Latin, that has survived. And it's a fascinating story because it shows that the belief in strange objects carrying people above the earth, and of course the people called that region that they came from, they called it Magonia, the magical land between the clouds and the sky. And that belief was there throughout history.
Which is now, so do you feel that perhaps Agobard was one of those scientists throwing out data, and that there was some substance to possibly what the people had said?
Well, I had always for a long time, we only had a few stories like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, in Passport to Magonia, I tried to gather as many of those as I could, and I drew a parallel between the belief in elves and goblins and demons and angels and so on in the Middle Ages, and what they did, and the descriptions of them, and the modern folklore of ufology. And that made a lot of people mad. I mean, it made the folklore experts say, no. I mean, folklore has nothing to do with UFOs because there are no UFOs, and that's all ridiculous. And then, of course, the ufologists said, no, UFOs first appeared in 1947 when Kenneth Arnold saw his flying saucers, which, by the way, he never described as flying saucers. He said they were crescents in the sky that moved through the air like a saucer skipping on water. And that's where flying saucers came from in the media, in the press. But we have many cases in the 20th century before 1947. So it didn't start with Kenneth Arnold. And we have cases, of course, with the great airship waves in the U.S. in 1896, 1897. Charles Fort talks about cases of strange objects in the sky much before then, from scientific publications in the 18th and 19th century. So at some point, when you study a phenomenon, you want to know exactly when did this begin. That's an important point to study. And of course, in Passport to Magonia, I made the case that what's happening today is very similar to what happened before, except that what happened before was repressed or covered up by the church, and it re-emerged only through fairy tales and so on. But the people who studied those stories found witnesses, or people who remembered or had archived correspondence, manuscripts from their family, when people had actually seen these beings and seen objects from the sky associated with them. So I tried to gather as many of those as I could, but in those days, this was 1969, we didn't have the internet. It was really difficult to get access to these records, except in a few books, so I did the best I could. But I knew that I was just scratching the surface. Now, about 6 years ago, Chris Orbeck, who is a scholar of language and history, again, a young Englishman who lives in Madrid, contacted me and said he had continued that study. He had assembled a group of experts around the internet to help him track down the references on many of the older cases and then find new ones. And he had probably the largest collection of pre-Arnold UFO cases in the world. So he proposed that we work together, and I was absolutely delighted when he contacted me, because I had, of course, hoped that something like that would happen. Chris is a better scholar than I am. He's likely to publish many more books. He's a lot younger than I am, so in a way this is a generational transition here in this book. And we started working together. We merged our databases, and then we started arguing about the value of every case. He's not an astronomer, so he relied on me to eliminate the cases that could be comets or could be meteors or explainable natural phenomena. And we ended up with 500 cases.
Wow.
Many, many, many more than I ever dreamed of assembling in Passport to Magonia. Between Antiquity and 1879, we wanted to stop before there was any human dirigible, before there was any human object in the sky, and we wanted to stop before the modern era, before the Industrial Revolution, and of course the airplane.
Right. On the cover of the book shows a couple armies getting ready for battle and what looked to be saucers flying over them. Is that one of the cases in the book that refers to?
It's one of the cases we rejected, actually. And that's kind of funny, because the publisher, we had another suggestion for the cover, but the publisher wanted this because it's a dramatic story, and it is in the UFO literature, associated with Alexander the Great. The story goes that, in Mesopotamia, there were, during one of the great battles of Alexander the Great, there were strange objects seen over the two armies. And we tracked it down. We concluded that the story was spurious, that there was never any UFO there, that there may have been fiery objects. The idea of launching rockets over, the opponent, over the enemy, is not a new idea. In Mesopotamia and in the ancient armies were launching, fiery devices over the opposing armies, and those may have been hyped into the idea of unknown lights flying over the battlefield. So it's one of the stories we mentioned, but we rejected from the primary chronology, from the primary catalog.
But they kept it on the cover.
They kept it on the cover because it's a great story, and it's an example of the research we did.
Well, now we'll have to tell people they have to listen to this radio show to find out the story behind the cover.
Yes, exactly.
What were some of the, and it's great, Chris Auerbach and the Magonia Project, and in honor of your book, he called it. What were some of the stories he had collected that are some of your favorites?
Well, there were many stories. The book is in 3 parts. We wanted to have, in the 3rd part, an exhaustive analysis of the sources and the methods we used, because it's very important to disclose the methodology in something like this. For example, we decided not to include cases of entities that were not associated with a specific aerial phenomenon. And this was, the book is really the result of creative tension between Chris and myself. He is, in many cases, a better scholar than I am. He tracked down many of the more obscure references. I tracked down a few of them, but he did an extraordinary job alongside, with his group of scholars that he had assembled around the Internet. This is really a child of the Internet, because the things that I could not do in Magonia, you can do now. There are over 50,000 newspapers that put their collections online, including some, ancient, some old American newspapers and so on, where you can actually search from your living room using your computer. This was, of course, impossible before the Internet. Many museums have put their collections online, and you can search all that. And so we spent 6 years doing that. Nobody got paid. It was very much a labor of love. I would have wanted to include some borderline cases that I thought were an illustration of the sociological, historical impact of the phenomenon. One of the cases we fought long and hard, and I lost that battle, was about Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc has played, of course, her intervention in French and English history is a turning point in Western history. She was inspired by hearing voices and seeing beings of light. But Chris said, and he was right, that there was no UFO there. I mean, these beings did not come out of a globe of light or anything like that. They were just beings who spoke to her, and so we excluded it from the chronology. but it's one of the borderline cases. There were other cases where the beings were so important in the whole chronology that we kept the case. But Chris made the point, and rightly so, that if we begin to include, in the UFO literature today, of course, you have lots of cases of bedroom visitation where a being or short gray appears in the house, and those are, if we had started to include all those cases, it would be a 5,000-page book, not a 500-page book. So we decided not to include those, only to retain cases that were clearly identified with an aerial phenomenon.
Which makes sense, yeah, because, like you said, that would be a huge book otherwise.
Well, maybe somebody else will do it. It's like cryptozoology. If we begin to, we know that there are strange creatures associated with many UFO cases, but if we begin to do this, then it's a whole other. It expands the subject into another area, which is a legitimate area, but it wasn't what we wanted to do.
Were there some other cases where there were entities involved with a craft that were surprising to you that Chris had obtained?
We were about 50-50 in that, between Chris and myself. We both had cases like that with... he had many cases that came from China. And you should interview him, by the way. I mean,
I would love to.
Obviously, he has his own opinion on this, and
yeah,
given Skype or anything else, I mean, I'm sure he would be delighted to.
Yep, we're calling you on Skype right now.
Very good. Well, he could give you his side of the story. It's absolutely wonderful material. He had many cases, not many, but very, very interesting cases from China that involved dragons. Now, the question is, how do you translate dragon? I mean, the Western idea of a dragon is a big serpent with wings in the sky. But I don't think that's what the Chinese were describing. They were describing an entity that was, in some cases, almost mechanical. I mean, he had one case of a dragon with wheels, and the wheels fell off, and the people in the village carried the wheels away from the place where they had fallen.
Wow.
Well, I didn't know dragons had wheels, and so these mechanical dragons begin to look like UFOs, actually. So we had a lot of fun with this. It's absolutely fascinating material.
Somebody actually in the chat had asked a question around that. They're asking your thoughts on sky serpents or space serpents, and if you think there are some sort of biological life form.
Well, the answer is I don't know. But in many cases, what they describe, when they describe a huge serpent in the sky during a storm that is surrounded with lightning and everything else, and it destroys a village, I'm very tempted to say, well, that was a tornado. A tornado is a terrifying event. The column, it looks like a serpent whipping around in the sky, destroying everything. When you see it from, a mile away, it's very tempting to compare it to a great, serpent in the sky, surrounded with lightning and a storm and destroying everything along its way. So I'm tempted to think many of these cases were just tornadoes.
Yeah.
Just like there are many cases of aurora borealis that become translated into armies fighting in the sky with things of different colors and so on. Usually the the descriptions are pretty accurate. And of course, people didn't know what an aurora was, and those are not things you see very often. I've only seen a couple of aurorae myself.
Right.
Usually from an airplane flying, in the northern latitudes, and they are, formidable displays. And
Right.
people were obviously tempted to describe them in these terms, but
So
you can pretty much recognize what they were.
Well, yeah, no, with some of the lack of discovery or some of the science that we have, vocabulary kind of becomes an issue in how they describe what they see back then. I know in Magonia and you talk about, and I think it's a interesting one, fairy rings, and we still call them fairy rings. And now fairy rings we know as a ring of fungus. But of course, there is a lot of mythology and lore around that in Europe.
Yes, and there are also cases, as you know, in the modern literature where you have an object that lands
Right.
in a field and leaves a circle of depressed vegetation. I mean, think of the case of Trans-en-Provence in France that has been studied by the French equivalent of NASA and the French police force, which is absolutely unexplained. It's one of the unexplained cases in the French files.
Which kind of leads me to the question, in some of these cases, such as the wheels falling off of the dragon or the Trans-en-Provence, or in your sighting of what appears to be a very physical object, it's a saucer with a dome. It looks like a technology. Now, is your thinking that perhaps these are not technology, or perhaps technology from other places other than an extraterrestrial civilization, or that you're just willing to say you don't know, you can't say for sure it's extraterrestrial?
Well, by the way, if you ask that question of Chris, you'll probably get a different answer from me.
I'll ask him again.
I'm pretty convinced that there has to be a physical technology at the heart of any hypothesis we make here. I mean, we have enough cases, in my own work, which I'm happily returning to now that the book is finished. I'm going back to my own research, and my own research is about the physics of all this. We have residue of metallic residue that was left on the site of close encounters. We have very detailed descriptions of contemporary witnesses describing physical object. We have traces in cases that in many cases have not been published, and those are the cases I'm interested in. So I concentrate on currently about 6 or 7 cases that I call my golden keys, where I have access to the witnesses. The cases have not been in the press, and I can go back to the site and I can continue to study them. And we're beginning to see some, not physical explanations, but some real physics behind this. And that's, of course, very interesting. And that doesn't detract from the other levels of the phenomenon, the psychological level, the physiological level, which are equally interesting. But I believe there is an unknown technology at the core of all that. It doesn't have to be extraterrestrial. It could be extraterrestrial. But my plea to other researchers is to open the spectrum of hypotheses. I'm very encouraged by seeing physicists of the level of Dr. Kaku, Dr. Michio Kaku, exploring hypotheses that have to do with other dimensions, for example. And these are ideas that were marginal when we first explored them in the 60s and 70s. Today, this is mainstream physics.
Right.
The idea that there are more than 4 dimensions is mainstream physics. We don't know where it's going to lead us, but there have to be more than 4 dimensions if you want to account for, for string theory, if you want to account for cosmological phenomena, if you want to account for much of particle physics today, and certainly quantum mechanics. So these are legitimate areas of research in mainstream physics.
Which is...
so I'm very encouraged by that.
Yeah, it's excellent. Dr. Kaku is amazing. He has a truly open mind, which is wonderful to see and very refreshing. And it really, you mentioned something else with Japan and the equivalent of NASA researching UFOs. And I really think that this is something really important that doesn't get enough attention here in the United States. That France is really the only country truly researching, in an above-board kind of way. And I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that.
As far as we know, yes.
Right.
As you know, I've traveled in the Soviet Union, and the last time in the days of Gorbachev and Perestroika, when things were opening up and there were many studies going on. In fact, they had at the time when I was there in 1990, they had 3 parallel studies of UFOs by different groups. Some groups that were leaning to a skeptical viewpoint, which is still legitimate, and groups that were frankly, looking at the UFO hypothesis from a extraterrestrial standpoint. And I've stayed in touch with people there. They were very serious, and they had authority, to do this kind of research pretty much openly. France has a long history, going back to the days of Dr. Poher in 1975 when they created GEPAN. Today, GEPAN is more of a group that responds to the public. The idea is that if you don't have a group like this, then the public can legitimately ask whether you're covering up something. And most of the cases, are cases that should be studied and should be studied openly. So I'm glad that France is keeping this small. It's a very small group, but I'm happy to be one of the advisors, to that group. It doesn't meet very often, but it keeps track. It stays in touch through the internet, and it keeps track of cases that have been reported in France. There is no funding behind it. The question you have to ask coming to the U.S. Is what? Tell me again what it is we're afraid of. As as scientists, come on. This is a joke. Why are we so afraid of going into the field, talking to the people who have seen these things, getting the data, and applying the tools of science? There are many tools of science today that can be applied to the observations without in a completely open way. You don't need to go into the paranormal aspects if you don't want to. You can just measure. You can measure pressures. You can measure temperature. You can measure visual, optical energy output. In many cases, you can actually compute that. And I've done it in one of my books called Confrontations. I've shown that you can go pretty far just in applying elementary tools. Tools that are on the level of physics 101 in college, and start looking for patterns. What is stopping us? What are we afraid of?
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate, and really, that's what I found interesting about some of the members of MUFON and their board is that coming from that same perspective, there are people who were engineers or John Schuessler who worked for NASA, and from the same perspective is unfortunately a lack of resources to do that kind of analysis, but just wanting and seeing benefit in doing that simple task of collecting the data you talked about.
And you have to do it without a presupposed hypothesis. I think one of the problems of ufology is that people start doing the research when they already have the answer, and they are trying to prove the answer they already have, and that's where the classical ufology, if you want, has failed. And what I'm trying to do is to say, come on, I mean, let's put that behind us, and let's go with no preconceived idea. One of the things we've been very careful of in Wonders in the Sky, and one of the things where Chris and I have absolutely the same philosophy, is we didn't want to have a hypothesis. We want to leave it. We see this book as a beginning, not as an end. We know there is a lot more material. We've done, I think, a fair job of looking at the extant literature, tracking it down to the original references, but we don't read Chinese, especially ancient Chinese. We don't read Japanese. We don't read ancient Egyptian. And there must be a lot of records that scholars should be alerted to, scholars of other things, but when they come across, when they go through their collections, when they come across a report of something in the sky, we hope that they will be alerted to it now. And we certainly hope to start a new wave of scholars, especially in Japan and China, where we know there are ancient records going back to their archives and looking at it. And also in Western Europe, there are enormous collections of manuscripts, of correspondence, in the attics of old castles that historians go through from time to time. And, we have a few examples of letters by someone writing to his mother and saying, oh, by the way, we saw something strange in the sky last night. And those are, of course, the best cases because they have not been tarnished by being, in the media.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people, and like you say, even in this field, they have a hard time saying, I don't know, or admitting to the fact that they don't have all the answers. And unfortunately, we don't. And this attempt to feel like they have the answers kind of fill some gaps, which with poor information.
But that's the way science works. And what was fascinating to me was going through, when you get to the 17th century in this book, and by the way, we are very well aware that the social environment changed from one century to the next. So we've organized the chronology one century at a time with a forward and an epilogue for every period, explaining what was going on in science and technology and communication and printing and everything else, and religion and history during that particular century, because you cannot assess the value of a case apart from the environment, the social environment, and the belief system of the time. So we're very careful to do that, and we are not naive in doing that. But when you come to the 17th and 18th century, you see of course, the rise of science and the open-minded. I mean, the people who are among the witnesses we cite are people like Lagrange and Cassini and Messier and Le Verrier and so on, and people who were the luminaries of Western science, the secretary of the Royal Society in England and so on. And these are the people who are actual witnesses, and they are publishing their observations openly. Cassini saw an object he could not explain in the sky. He didn't publish it the first time, but he published it when he saw it again, with his telescope the second time. And that's the behavior of a true scientist.
Right.
He did not have an explanation for it, but he wanted to note what he had seen and put it on the record. That's how science was built, and we're forgetting that. And we're not teaching that anymore, and we should be teaching it.
Yeah. Now, one question I want to ask before we're done here, and we don't have too long, is another kind of challenge that you sent out there that created a buzz actually around our office is your recent blogs on crop circles and suggesting some ideas around possible military answers. But you had said, and is it true, was that more of a sociological type of thing, or do you think that it's a most likely answer that it's the military?
Well,
or go ahead.
With crop circles, there is a polarization of opinions. Most people believe that they are just hoaxes, and then there is a smaller but very vocal section of the New Age, if you want, New Age believers, who think that there are signals from some other civilization, alien civilization, or or paranormal consciousness. And it's very interesting to see that kind of polarization, because in the middle there are perfectly good explanations for some of the more interesting circles.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that, so I'm well aware that, and I'm very interested in that because I'm interested in, as you know, I'm fascinated with the internet. I had the privilege of working on the early internet, which was called the ARPANET.
Right.
And of course, I've remained involved in that through the investments that we're making now with our venture funds in internet-related and web-related technology. The internet is being used now to both propose new ideas that are called memes. A meme is to the human culture what a gene is to the human organism. It's an idea that people are planting very often in innocuous ways through the internet, through the social networks, to influence the culture. And some of that is social engineering. And some of that can be used to hide things in plain sight. Now, what's interesting about the crop circles is that people have researched them for 30 years, and there have been studies done in part by the French, by the way, in the French military, looking at what it would take to create these circles from the sky, not necessarily from space, with invisible devices that we have, with beams, and of course the beams would not be developed in order to bend, corn. They would be developed for military purposes, but you would have to develop them and calibrate them in plain sight. So the question is, how do you hide a technology like that, which is a military technology which is being deployed, so that nobody notices what you're doing? Well, you can hide it as a New Age phenomenon, and there are more, many people who will jump to the opportunity to do that. And you can also hide it by planting the idea that these are done by hoaxers, especially since there are hoaxers doing most of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know who they are.
For sure. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think we got the idea, and I love the concept of the memes and hiding in plain sight. I think that was a good description. But we are out of time. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure. And again, I think you should talk to Chris, and you'd get probably a different slant on the whole subject.
I'm definitely going to try to get a hold of him. Everybody, the book is Wonders in the Sky, and you can find that on Amazon.com. Again, thank you so much for being on the show. And coming up next week, we do have an interview with Linda Howe, where she described an event where she was taken into an Air Force base, told all about really all the answers regarding ETs and UFOs, and she believes all of this is real. So you want to tune in next week. Thanks for listening to Open Minds Radio, your UFO news authority. We're out of time. Talk to you next week.